The pews are packed, the organ swells, and from behind the pulpit comes not just a sermon about salvation, but a fiery declaration about who you should vote for. The cross stands beside a campaign banner, and the collection plate mingles with voter registration cards. This isn't some dystopian future, this is Sunday morning in America, and it's been this way for decades. But it wasn't always like this. There was a time when ministers avoided politics like the plague, when churches stayed carefully neutral, and when mixing faith with partisan politics was considered scandalous. So what changed? How did we get from render unto Caesar what is Caesar's to pastors endorsing candidates from the pulpit? The story begins not in a megachurch in Texas or a cathedral in Rome, but in a small Virginia courtroom in 1801, where a Baptist preacher named John Leland was fighting for something that would eventually turn Christianity upside down: the separation of church and state. Leland, a close friend of Thomas Jefferson, had spent years advocating for religious freedom. He understood something profound that many of his contemporaries missed: that the wall between church and state wasn't meant to keep religion out of public life, but to protect religion from political corruption. The notion of a Christian commonwealth, Leland wrote, should be exploded forever. For the first century and a half of American Christianity, most religious leaders heeded this wisdom. They preached about moral issues, certainly, but they avoided partisan endorsements. The Methodist Church, for instance, had strict rules prohibiting ministers from holding political office or campaigning for candidates. The idea was simple: Christ's kingdom was not of this world, and mixing the sacred with the political would corrupt both. But everything changed in 1925 in a sweltering courthouse in Dayton, Tennessee. The Scopes trial, the famous monkey trial, wasn't just about evolution versus creation. It was the moment when American Christianity realized it was losing the culture war, and losing badly. William Jennings Bryan, the three-time presidential candidate who served as prosecutor, was humiliated on the witness stand by defense attorney Clarence Darrow. When Bryan died just 5 days after the trial ended, many saw it as symbolic. Traditional Christianity was dying too. The fundamentalists retreated. For decades, they built their own schools, their own colleges, their own media networks. They created a parallel Christian culture, convinced that mainstream America had become irredeemably secular. Politics, they believed, was a dirty business best left to worldly people. But they were waiting, and in 1954 they got a wake-up call that would change everything. That year, a young preacher named Jerry Falwell founded Thomas Road Baptist Church in an abandoned bottling plant in Lynchburg, Virginia. Falwell was different from other fundamentalist preachers. He was ambitious, media-savvy, and utterly convinced that Christians needed to reclaim America. But even Falwell in those early days preached the traditional line. In 1965, he gave a sermon titled Ministers and Marches, where he declared, "Preachers are not called to be politicians, but to be soul winners." He wouldn't stick to that position for long. The catalyst came from an unexpected source: the Internal Revenue Service. In 1970, the IRS announced it would no longer grant tax-exempt status to private schools that practiced racial discrimination. For many white Christian schools in the South, schools that had been founded after the Brown versus Board decision to avoid integration, this was an existential threat. Bob Jones University, the flagship institution of fundamentalist higher education, lost its tax exemption in 1983 after fighting the IRS for 13 years. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled 8-1 against the university. The fundamentalist community was stunned. The federal government, they realized, could destroy their institutions with the stroke of a pen. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The issue that truly mobilized evangelical Christians wasn't abortion, at least not initially. The Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination, actually passed resolutions in 1971, 1974, and 1976 supporting a woman's right to choose in cases of rape, incest, severe fetal abnormality, or threats to maternal health. Jerry Falwell didn't preach his first anti-abortion sermon until 1978, 5 years after Roe v. Wade. The real mobilization began with a phone call in 1976. Paul Weyrich, a Catholic political operative, And Richard Viguerie, a master of direct mail fundraising, approached Falwell with a proposition. They needed evangelical foot soldiers for the conservative movement, and Falwell had a television ministry reaching millions of viewers every week. Warwick was blunt about the strategy. Years later, he would admit, what galvanized the Christian community was not abortion, which Falwell first began to preach against in 1978, 5 years after Roe, but the federal attack on Christian schools through the IRS. But abortion, Warwick realized, was a more palatable rallying cry than defending segregated schools. The transformation was swift and dramatic. In 1979, Falwell founded the Moral Majority, declaring, "We must turn America around or prepare for inevitable decay and moral catastrophe." The organization registered millions of new voters and helped elect Ronald Reagan in 1980. Suddenly, every political issue became a moral issue, and every moral issue became grounds for political mobilization. But something else was happening too, something that would prove even more significant. Christian television was exploding. Pat Robertson's 700 Club, Jim Bakker's PTL Club, and dozens of other programs were bringing a new kind of Christianity into American living rooms. These weren't your grandfather's reserved Presbyterian ministers. They were charismatic, emotional, and intensely political. Robertson took it furthest. In 1988, he actually ran for president, finishing second in the Iowa Republican caucus ahead of George H.W. Bush. Though his campaign ultimately failed, Robertson had proven something important. Evangelical Christians could be a decisive political force. He used his mailing list of supporters to found the Christian Coalition, which by the 1990s was distributing tens of millions of voter guides in churches across America. The Clinton years marked another turning point. The Monica Lewinsky scandal convinced many evangelical leaders that character mattered in politics. They had found their ultimate cause, defending moral values against liberal permissiveness. The pulpit became a political platform, and Sunday sermons increasingly sounded like campaign speeches. By 2004, evangelical turnout helped re-elect George W. Bush, and exit polls showed that moral values was the top issue for voters. Churches had become de facto campaign headquarters, and pastors had become political kingmakers. But the most shocking transformation was yet to come. In 2016, white evangelical Christians, the same people who had spent decades preaching about moral character and family values, gave their overwhelming support to Donald Trump. 81% voted for a thrice-married casino owner who had bragged about sexual assault and rarely attended church. Jerry Falwell Jr., son of the Moral Majority founder, became one of Trump's earliest and most vocal supporters, even appearing at campaign rallies. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. How could the same religious movement that had impeached Bill Clinton for his moral failings embrace Trump so enthusiastically? The answer reveals something profound about how politics had changed American Christianity. Faith had become tribal. It wasn't about following Christ's teachings or even about moral behavior. It was about political power and cultural identity. The church had become a political party, and the political party had become a kind of church. Consider this statistic. In 1998, only 30% of white evangelical Protestants said that personal moral failings didn't disqualify political leaders. By 2016, that number had soared to 72%. The Trump effect had fundamentally altered evangelical attitudes about morality and politics. The consequences have been dramatic. Church attendance has been declining for decades, but the politicization of Christianity has accelerated the trend. Young people in particular are fleeing churches they see as hypocritical and power-hungry. A 2021 survey found that 29% of Americans who have left their childhood religion cite political reasons as a major factor. But it's not just about numbers. The very nature of American Christianity has changed. Sermons that once focused on personal salvation now rage about election fraud and vaccine mandates. Churches that once preached love and forgiveness now preach fear and resentment. The cross has been draped in the American flag so tightly that many believers can no longer tell where their faith ends and their politics begin. Some church leaders have tried to resist this trend. Russell Moore, former president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, has been a vocal critic of the politicization of Christianity. He's paid a price for it, facing constant attacks from his own denomination, before eventually leaving to join Christianity Today magazine. The church, Moore has warned, is not the lobbying arm of any political party. When we lose that distinction, we lose our prophetic voice. But his voice has been largely drowned out by the megachurch pastors and television evangelists who have turned politics into their primary ministry. Some, like Kenneth Copeland and Paula White, have accumulated enormous wealth and political influence by blending prosperity theology with political activism. The transformation is perhaps most visible in the phenomenon of prophetic politics, the belief that certain political leaders are chosen by God to fulfill divine purposes. During the Trump presidency, numerous charismatic leaders claimed to receive prophetic revelations about Trump's victory in 2020. When those prophecies failed, some admitted error, but many doubled down, claiming the election was stolen. Here's a question for you. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it? Are you sitting in your car during a lunch break, staying up late scrolling through videos, or maybe watching with a cup of coffee on a Sunday morning? I'm genuinely curious about our audience here at Professor Archive. Drop a comment and let me know what profession you're in or what brought you to this topic today. The global implications of American Christianity's political transformation extend far beyond U.S. borders. American evangelical organizations have exported their political theology to Africa, Latin America, and Asia, often with troubling results. In Uganda, American evangelical influence contributed to anti-LGBTQ legislation. In Brazil, evangelical political movements have gained enormous power, helping elect leaders like Jair Bolsonaro. Meanwhile, in many European countries where church and state have historically been intertwined, there's been movement in the opposite direction. The Church of England has become less political over time, and even in traditionally Catholic countries like Ireland and Poland, the political influence of churches has waned significantly. The contrast is striking. As European Christianity has become more spiritually focused and less politically engaged, American Christianity has moved in precisely the opposite direction. What's particularly fascinating is how this transformation has created strange bedfellows. Catholic bishops find themselves aligned with Baptist preachers they would have considered heretics 50 years ago. Charismatic prosperity preachers work hand in hand with traditional Reformed theologians who despise their theology. What unites them isn't doctrine, it's politics. The irony is profound. The American founders who established separation of church and state weren't hostile to religion. Many were deeply devout. They understood that mixing faith with political power corrupts both institutions. George Washington himself warned against the cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men who would exploit religious sentiment for political gain. Thomas Jefferson, in his famous letter to the Danbury Baptists, spoke of a wall of separation between church and state. But Jefferson saw this wall as protecting religion, not restricting it. He understood what many modern Christians seem to have forgotten. When the church becomes a political institution, it stops being the church. The theological implications are staggering. Christianity began as a religion of the marginalized, the poor, and the powerless. Jesus explicitly rejected political power, telling Pilate that his kingdom was not of this world. The early Christians were persecuted precisely because they refused to bow to political authority. Yet American Christianity has become obsessed with political power, often at the expense of its original mission. Food banks and homeless shelters, traditionally Christian ministries, now compete for resources with political action committees and lobbying groups. Some of the most compelling voices calling for change are coming from unexpected places. Young evangelical leaders, particularly people of color and women, are challenging the white male political establishment that has dominated evangelical institutions. They're asking uncomfortable questions. How can a faith centered on serving others become so focused on political dominance? How can followers of Jesus support policies that harm immigrants, the poor, and the marginalized? The racial dimensions of this transformation are particularly complex. Black churches have always been political. They had to be, given the history of slavery and segregation. but their political engagement has typically focused on justice and civil rights, not partisan politics. The civil rights movement was deeply rooted in Christian theology, but it challenged both major political parties. White evangelical political engagement, by contrast, has been overwhelmingly partisan and often focused on maintaining social and political dominance. This has created a stark divide within American Christianity, with black and white Christians holding vastly different political views despite sharing similar theological beliefs. Hispanic and Asian American Christians represent a growing and influential middle ground, often holding conservative theological views while supporting more progressive political positions on immigration and social justice. Their voices may be crucial in determining the future direction of American Christianity. The financial dimensions of politicized Christianity are staggering. Religious political organizations now raise and spend hundreds of millions of dollars every election cycle. The Faith and Freedom Coalition, founded by Ralph Reed, claims to have distributed 50 million voter guides in 2020. Focus on the Family spent over $18 million on political activities in 2020, while the Family Research Council spent another $13 million. These organizations operate in a legal gray area, using their tax-exempt status while engaging in what critics argue is essentially partisan political activity. The IRS has historically been reluctant to challenge churches and religious organizations, creating a system where political activity can flourish under the banner of religious freedom. The psychological and sociological factors driving this transformation are equally fascinating. Research shows that when people feel their group identity is threatened, they become more tribal and more willing to compromise their stated values to defend their tribe. For many white evangelical Christians, rapid social change on issues like LGBTQ rights, racial justice, and religious freedom has created a sense of siege mentality. This explains why Trump, despite his obvious moral failings, became so popular among evangelicals. He promised to protect their tribal interests, even if he didn't share their personal values. The bargain was explicit: political protection in exchange for religious support. But this bargain has come at an enormous cost. Public trust in religious institutions has plummeted. According to Gallup polling, confidence in organized religion has fallen from 68% in 1975 to just 37% in 2021. Among young adults, the decline is even steeper. The knowns, people who claim no religious affiliation, now represent the fastest growing religious category in America. Many are former evangelicals who became disillusioned with the politicization of their faith. They haven't necessarily lost their spiritual beliefs, but they've lost faith in religious institutions. Some churches are beginning to recognize the problem. Willow Creek Community Church, once a flagship of the evangelical movement, has undergone significant soul-searching after scandals involving its founding pastor. Many megachurches are quietly backing away from explicit political endorsements, recognizing that political partisanship is driving away members. The question facing American Christianity is whether this course correction can happen fast enough to prevent further damage. Some theologians argue that the politicization has gone too far, that American Christianity has fundamentally lost its way and needs a complete reformation. Others are more optimistic, pointing to young Christian leaders who are trying to reclaim their faith from political opportunists. They're reading the same Bible that inspired the civil rights movement and asking why contemporary Christianity seems so focused on political power rather than social justice. If you're finding value in this deep dive into how politics transformed American Christianity, and if you appreciate the research and storytelling that goes into these Professor Archive documentaries, consider leaving a super thanks. Your support helps us continue producing these in-depth explorations of history's most fascinating and important stories. The international perspective offers some hope. In countries like South Korea, Christianity has grown rapidly while remaining largely separate from partisan politics. South Korean churches focus primarily on worship, community service, and evangelism, the traditional functions of religious institutions. They've avoided the trap that has ensnared American Christianity. Similarly, the African church, now the fastest-growing segment of global Christianity, has maintained a focus on social justice and community service while avoiding the kind of partisan political engagement that characterizes American evangelicalism. African Christian leaders often express bewilderment at the political obsessions of their American counterparts. Perhaps most telling is the Catholic Church's recent trajectory. Pope Francis has explicitly warned against the politicization of faith, declaring that the gospel is not an ideology, and criticizing Christians who use the gospel to promote themselves or to promote their own personal ideas. His message represents a direct challenge to the American model of political Christianity. The way forward won't be easy. Generations of American Christians have been taught that political engagement is a religious duty, that voting is a form of worship, and that their faith requires them to support specific political positions. Untangling this web of religious and political identity will require courageous leadership from within the Christian community. Some are already trying. Organizations like Sojourners, led by Jim Wallace, have long advocated for a progressive Christian politics focused on social justice rather than culture war issues. The Evangelical Environmental Network has challenged conservative Christians to take climate change seriously as a moral issue. Christians for Social Action has worked to broaden evangelical political engagement beyond abortion and LGBTQ issues. These voices remain marginalized within mainstream evangelicalism, but they represent a potential alternative path, one that takes Christian political engagement seriously without reducing faith to partisan politics. The story of how politics took over the American pulpit is ultimately a cautionary tale about the seductive nature of power. Religious institutions, like all human institutions, are vulnerable to corruption. When churches prioritize political influence over spiritual formation, they lose their prophetic voice and their moral authority. But it's also a story about redemption. The possibility that institutions can recognize their mistakes and choose a different path. Throughout Christian history, reform movements have emerged to call the church back to its original mission. The Protestant Reformation, the social gospel movement, the civil rights movement, all represented attempts to align Christian practice with Christian principles. Perhaps we're witnessing the beginning of another such movement today. Young Christians who grew up during the culture wars are asking hard questions about the relationship between faith and politics. They're reading the Sermon on the Mount and wondering how Jesus' teachings about loving enemies and caring for the poor became secondary to political power. The stakes couldn't be higher. Christianity remains the world's largest religion, with over 2.4 billion adherents. In America, Christians still represent about 65% of the population. How they understand the relationship between faith and politics will shape not just the future of Christianity, but the future of American democracy itself. The choice facing American Christians is clear. They can continue down the path of political partisanship, further alienating young people and minorities while gaining temporary political victories. Or they can reclaim their prophetic voice, speaking truth to power regardless of which party holds office, and focusing on the spiritual and moral formation that has always been the Church's primary mission. History suggests that religious institutions survive and thrive when they remain true to their core spiritual mission. They decline when they become mere appendages of political movements. The early Christian church grew rapidly despite, or perhaps because of, its refusal to seek political power. Its focus on spiritual transformation and social service made it attractive to people across all social and economic lines. The question is whether American Christianity can rediscover this original vision, or whether it will continue its transformation into something Jesus himself might not recognize, a political organization that happens to meet on Sundays. The answer will determine not just the future of American Christianity, but the future of American society itself. For better or worse, the pulpit and the ballot box have become intertwined in ways the founders never imagined. How that relationship evolves will shape the next chapter of both American religion and American democracy. The story continues to unfold every Sunday morning in churches across the country, as pastors decide whether to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ or the gospel according to their preferred political party. The choice they make will echo through eternity, both the eternal salvation they claim to care about and the very earthly political systems they've chosen to embrace. This has been Professor Archive, exploring the complex intersection of faith and power in American history. The story of how politics took over the pulpit is far from finished. In fact, we may be living through its most important chapter right now.